Well, welcome everyone to our last session of Vizmath, and I'm Betty Hurley-Dasgupta, and I'm here with Carol Yeager with co-facilitators of Vizmath, and we're very pleased to have Robert Lang here to talk about mathematical methods in origami. And I've seen the slides. This will be a wonderful presentation. So thank you, Robert.
You're welcome. So shall we start?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so mathematical methods in origami. First question you might well ask is, why do we need math in origami, and could math even have a role to play? And it does. Most people think of origami as something simple enough it wouldn't need math. They think of it something like this. This is a very old image from 1734. It shows origami. That's the kind of origami people were doing hundreds of years ago. That's what people often think origami is today. Origami changed in the middle of the 20th century due to this man, Akira Shizawa, who began creating new designs. And his work inspired a generation of folders, so that modern origami is now very different from that traditional Japanese origami. It's different in a lot of ways. It's a lot more complex. Sometimes it's even mathematical. And there are hundreds and really thousands of new designs. And these designs and the works all kind of come together to create a question. What changed in origami? And what changed is actually that math came to origami. Artists came to origami, but we began to apply mathematical principles. And there's two broad mathematical fields that relate to origami. One we call origami mathematics, and that you might think of as the more abstract mathematics, a formal description. How do we describe origami using mathematical terms? But those descriptions let us create tools. That tools is the second set, computational origami. How do we actually design complex figures? And so what I want to talk about a little bit today is to give you a sense of how we can actually use math to design complex origami shapes. Now, to do that, we need a little bit of a language, a way of describing origami that's amenable to mathematics. And that description comes from a thing we'll call a crease pattern. This slide shows a crease pattern. You see there's two lines in the top image. That's a map of the folds in the pattern. And the folds can go two directions. And if it folds upward, it's shaped like a valley. We call it a valley fold. If it's bent downward, it's shaped like a mountain. We call it a mountain fold. And so that crease pattern up top is a map of a 3D origami figure that you see down at the bottom. Now this is a simple crease pattern, but crease patterns can be far more complex than this. They can have hundreds of creases, they can have thousands of creases, they can have so many creases that our collaboration software can't even manage to display them. But no matter how complicated it is, all of those patterns are still composed of nothing more than mountains and valleys. So how do we come up with them? Well, one way is to express our design goal as an equation. And this is a very abstract equation. We start with an idea, we combine it with a square, we somehow get a folded shape. But what we'll do is to take this equation and break it down into its parts and find the math within this equation. And you might ask, can you be so specific about what you want? And this shape I show here, what I want to fold is a stag beetle. Can I actually make a specific type of beetle? The answer is yes, we can. But how do we do it? And the way we do it is we take that equation and we spread it out. And we look at what are the easy parts, what are the hard parts, what are the human parts, and what are the mathematical parts. The human part is an abstraction, going from the subject to some sort of abstract description, a stick figure that conveys just the structural information. We can figure that out. And another human and I'll say easy part is to go from the base a folded representation that has kind of the raw structure to the finished model, because we just shape it. You bend the legs, you curve the jaws, you thin the antenna. The hard part is going from an abstract stick figure to a folded shape. But that is the mathematical step. So let's zoom in on that step. I have a stick figure, and I want to create a folded shape whose shadow is that stick figure. And what is that folded shape? We call it a base in origami, but really it's a collection of flaps of paper. One flap for every arm or leg or appendage of the stick figure. And so our mathematical problem is, how do we make a bunch of flaps? And one of the things we often do in math and science and engineering is, when we're presented with a hard problem, we try to break it down into easy problems. And so the easiest way of describing this problem, or the easiest version of this problem, how do you make a bunch of flaps, would be, how do you make one flap? So let's zoom in on that. How do you make a flap from a piece of paper? So I'll give you a sheet of paper, and I say make a flap. And you say, what's a flap? And I say it's kind of long and skinny. And you know how to do that. You'd fold it in half and in half again until it gets kind of long and skinny. And when you're done, you'd have a flap. Let's say the flap is of length L, and that comes from the tip of this long, skinny shape. And if I ask you how much paper you needed, you could figure that out by unfolding it, and you'd see that all of the paper in the upper left corner is the paper that went into the flap. That's how much was needed for the flap, and everything else is kind of left over. Now, if I said make a skinnier flap, you could do that, and you'd find it's kind of the same structure, but the amount of paper you need is a little bit less, because that boundary is now sort of smoothed off. And as you make the flap skinnier and skinnier, that boundary between flap and non-flap gets smoother and smoother, so that in the limit of an infinitely skinny flap, the least amount of paper you'd need, the amount of paper you need becomes a quarter circle. So it takes a quarter circle to make that particular flap, at least. Now that flap came from the corner, but we could look at flaps on the edges or flaps in the middle, and we find a flap from an edge requires a half circle of paper. A flap in the middle requires a full circle. And really, this is all one idea. Anytime you need a flap, it takes up some part of a circle. If the circle overlaps a corner, that's the quarter circle. If it overlaps an edge, it's a half, and in the middle, it's a full. So always, a flap requires a circle of paper. And that's the key insight we need to go back and solve the harder problem. How do we design a shape that has many flaps? We just use many circles, one for each flap. So if we want to make a spider that's got, say, 8 legs, it's going to have a base with 8 pairs of flaps, we can find the arrangement by finding a packing of 8 circles on a square. And that tells us how we allocate the paper for this design. Now, it doesn't actually tell us where we make the folds. But once we have the packing, we can go back and break up the stick figure, break up the circle pattern into smaller regions, and find folds that make smaller pieces of stick figures. So this 6-legged stick figure can be broken up into a bunch of smaller stick figures. And all we need to do is find folds that fold a little bit of paper into a smaller stick figure. And these are well known now in origami. We call them molecules. And this is a molecule, a pattern of folds for any triangle that makes a 3-legged shape from the paper, and that gives us a 3-legged stick figure. There are patterns that work for 4-legged figures. And once we have these patterns, we can fit them together on top of a circle packing to get an entire crease pattern. And that crease pattern may be tremendously complicated like this one, but it's guaranteed to fold into a base that has the right number of flaps, that's guaranteed to have the right number and length and distribution of flaps to make the thing that we're after. And so we can follow a very systematic design process and then fold the real origami shape we were after. And this process, this technique can be written down. It can even be automated. You can write a computer program to carry out the analysis. And I did that a few years ago. wrote a computer program that takes takes a stick figure, converts it into circles, converts that into equations, and when we solve the equations, it will give us a crease pattern. And this is a crease pattern for that stick figure. And if you take this crease pattern and you fold it up, you'll get a base that, with a little more shaping, will give you exactly the stick figure we're after, which in this case is a deer. And this is a white-tailed deer. It's a particular type of deer, but we could make a different deer, a mule deer, which has a different antler pattern, simply by finding a different arrangement of our circles, or even an elk, or even a moose, or really any kind of animal we want. This technique works for anything that has lots of legs or branched structures. So not just the spider that I used as an example, but we can do dragonfly with 6 legs and wings, or a beetle, and even more complicated beetles, the Japanese horned beetle, Eupatorus gracilicornis, which is a famous 5-horned beetle, even beetles that have feathers on their antenna. We can make long-legged shapes like praying mantises. We can even make more than one subject, like 2 praying mantises, still from a single uncut square. But we can use these techniques not just to make ever more complicated insects, but we can use it to create art, figures, animals, shapes of all types. We can use it to put feathers and toes on a flying bird, or the face on an owl, claws and teeth on a grizzly bear, toes and eyes on a frog, human figures, even more than one figure from the same sheet. The man playing the guitar is a single sheet of paper. The man playing a bass is from a single sheet of paper. And if you want a more complex instrument than either of those, well, we can do that as well, still from a single sheet of paper. And we don't have to be flat. You see this instrumentalist. This is 3-dimensional, and we can make fully 3D origami shapes, and shapes that are not necessarily representational, but perhaps just geometrically abstract. This is a shape that was I saw about 10 years ago now, developed by a fellow named Chris Palmer, and this concept, this rotational symmetry, can be generalized. And I've written a computer program that generalizes it, and have used it to make pots, both polyhedral shapes with sharp edges, but also rounded, smooth, curved shapes. For many years, curves were thought to be the holy grail of origami, so I had to do a holy grail. And as I said, I wrote a computer program, and this is downloadable. If you go to the Wolfram demonstration site, you can download a little demonstration program that lets you move around points that define the cross-section, and it gives you both the crease pattern and the rendering of the folded form for that shape. And once we have a mathematical theory, and perhaps computer programs to create these shapes, then we can do something else. We can take origami out of the realm of art and move it into technology, into engineering, into the real world of practice. And so people have used mathematical origami techniques to solve engineering problems. Some of them very, very straightforward and low-tech, like Koryo Miura developed an unfoldable map based on an origami pattern. But this same pattern can be used for quite high-tech applications, and was. Miura's origami pattern was used for a fold-up solar array that flew on a Japanese mission in 1995. Several years back, I worked on a project with Lawrence Livermore Lab, and we used origami to design a fold-up telescope lens. So you have a flat lens, and it folds up into a small cylinder. And it gets smaller so that it can fit within a spacecraft to send it up into space, where it would unfold and do its duty. And the Livermore folks used that origami pattern for their first generation lens, which is shown here. It's a 5-meter lens. Folds down to much smaller size. It needs to be big and flat at its destination, but small for the journey. And we find that combination of problems in lots of places, not just space, but also even in the human body, in medical implants, which need to be folded up to go into your body, and then they unfold in some way. They deploy when they get to their destination. And this is an example of such a medical implant developed by Zhang Yu at Oxford University and Kaori Kurabayashi. It's a heart stent. It's made from stainless steel. It folds up into a small shape, which is shown on the left, and that gets threaded through an artery till it gets to its destination, where it unfolds into a tube to hold open the blocked artery. This idea of folding can be taken to incredibly small size. How small? Paul Rothman at Caltech actually folds DNA. And so this image shows atomic force micrographs of DNA structures, some kind of whimsical, like stars and smiley faces, but these techniques can be used to fold shapes that carry anti-cancer drugs, that make little boxes that travel through the bloodstream, and when they get to the cancer cell, they open up and release the payload. And we're seeing each year more and more people demonstrating real practical technology using these types of origami techniques. And if you're interested in finding out more about these types of techniques, there's been a series of origami conferences on origami in science and math. And they have a proceedings book that describes many of the things I've described here and many more besides. It's called the latest book and the latest conference. It's called Origami 5. The next conference is going to be in 2014. And so if you're interested in finding out more, this would be a great place to start. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and we'll spend the next 40 minutes or so answering questions.
That's wonderful, and a great presentation, and some beautiful visualizations there. For those of you who want to ask questions, we'll go through. I think we saw more comments than questions, so please type in questions, or if you have a headset and want to talk, or you have your audio working, you can raise your hand.
This is Carol Yeager, and I have a quick question for you. I'm wondering, Robert, on some of those figures, what is the size of the end product? And I'm talking about the animals that you were making that had so many folds. And what size paper do you start with?
I heard someone talking, but I couldn't make out any of what you said. Could you either ask again, maybe a little louder, or you could type the question into the chat window?
I heard it, Robert, so let me see if I can do it with Carol. I think she wanted to get a better sense of size, and also what size of paper you started with. Carol, you can let us know if I got that right.
Yes, I wondered the size paper you start with and the size of the figure that you ended up with. I was particularly thinking of the animals.
Most of the art pieces were probably anywhere from about 10 centimeters to 30 centimeters across when folded. The insects tended to be a little on the smaller side, 10 to 15 centimeters. Things like the pots and the like are larger, 20 to 30 centimeters. Typically, the paper used for folding will be, most of what I use is going to be on the order of, let's say, 25 to 50 centimeters in size. And that's the most common. It's possible to go much smaller, down to 1 to 2 centimeters, and much larger, up to a couple of meters. But probably 25 to 50 is kind of the sweet spot for paper size.
I'm also wondering what drew you to origami. What was your first inspiration for working with origami, and then how did it take off?
Couldn't hear that again. Could Betty translate or type it in?
Yeah. Hi, Robert. Carol wanted to know what led you to the whole subject area of origami.
what led me to origami was a book when I was 6 years old. I don't remember precisely how, acquired a book when I was 6 that had some origami instructions in it. And I thought, well, this is an interesting puzzle, and it's a way of making things, so I'm going to try this. And that just kind of got me hooked. The thing that hooked me originally was, I think in large part, the fact that I needed nothing more than paper. And scrap paper was all around, so I didn't need any special tools or equipment or anything like that. I could just find scrap paper and I could make shapes, and I could make many things with nothing more than paper. And in a sense, that's still a lot of the appeal, that the unending possibilities of what can be made when still all you need is an uncut sheet of paper as material.
That's great. Robert, we have someone at the college who actually is expertise in fabric arts, kind of as a side interest. I think a number of people know her, Nan. And she was really disappointed. She had another meeting that she wasn't able to attend your presentation. And she does have your book, and she does work with students in thinking through origami through fabric arts. And she was saying she's looking now at a combination of paper and fabric, which sounded fascinating. So this is her question. I asked her to email it to me. She wants to get a better idea of what the thinking process is in when you are because you talked about the circles and then went to creating the design of the creases. What are the patterns you're looking for in developing the design? And then also, how do you take a 3D idea, go to the 2D to fold, and go back to the 3D? And maybe go back to the slides, because I know you touched on it a little bit, but I'm sure she and other of us would love to hear a little bit more just about how you, what is the thinking process that goes from the object you want to do and then the reality of it.
So I didn't quite catch all of that. I think I heard you say that you wanted to know how to go from the 3D design to the folding pattern. Was that the question?
Yeah, that was the end part. She is interested in how to go from the 2D idea to the 3D design, and then back to the 2D is no, start with the 3D idea, I'm sorry, go to the 2D to fold, and then to the 3D. But just as you're doing that, what if you could elaborate more on the thinking process in doing that, maybe in the programming, because you talked about being able to program that process. I think she's interested in hearing about on that slide where you said, well, this is the hard part. to elaborate more on what happens in that hard part.
Okay. So I'll talk about what happens in that hard part, but I actually need to qualify that slide, because when we come into it, I said, oh, the easy part is going from the idea to the abstract stick figure. And in a sense, that's easy for a human, but in another sense, that's actually the hard part, because it can't be automated. It's something that requires aesthetic judgment. And so if we were talking about computerizing the entire process, the first step and the last step are the things that people don't know how to compute. And the middle step, what I call the hard part, that's actually the first thing that could be automated. So in some sense, it's the easiest part. Now, let me kind of zoom in on that step. Going from the abstract description to the folded shape, the base. If the shape is, if the thing we're after is stick figure-like, then it really can be a very deterministic process, because we can establish a mathematical relationship between all of the parts of that shape and some geometric object. Every flap gives you a circle. The size of the circle is the length of the flap. And so if you were to, you could enumerate right down, these are all the flaps. I've got a head flap, an arm flap, a leg flap, and you could then create a circle for each of those flaps. And then finding the arrangement on the paper is a very strict tactile problem of finding an arrangement of circles. In fact, you can even cut out cardboard circles and move them around to play with different possible arrangements. Or what I often do is I use a computer drawing program where I can draw a circle and then move around circles on the screen. But you move them around, you find your arrangement, and that's the first half of the design. And then the process of filling in the creases, that's again a very kind of straightforward nuts and bolts process of drawing lines between the circle centers and then doing geometric constructions, the equivalent of compass and straight edge, to fill in all those creases. So there's a recipe, or as we say in computer science, an algorithm that we can follow to create the crease pattern. So that's actually a very straightforward process to go from the stick figure to the crease pattern, which will then fold into a 3D shape. The hard part is what happens outside of the math, which is the aesthetic choices that you make. What stick figure will I use to represent this subject? How long are its legs? How long are its arms? And so forth. And then at the back end, the aesthetic choices of how do I add additional folds to shape a flap into a leg? Do I just make a zigzag fold? Do I put in joints? Will I try to put claws on the ends of the feet? Again, these are all aesthetic choices, and those are the things that can't be reduced to mathematics, but that's where the art comes in.
That's great. We had a few people join late, and I went back to one of the slides just to give them a little bit of background. There's a long message that just came up. Can you see it from Veronica, or do you want me to read it out to you, Robert?
I see it from Veronica. Hang just a, let's see. Veronica says, I'm interested in hearing about the process you went through to go from looking at a variety of origami figures to deciding it can be represented as a stick figure in the circles. What was the aha moment? In addition, figures like the pots don't look like flaps. Very perceptive questions from Veronica. Both really good questions. So let me, and they have very different answers. So let me start by talking about the process to go through. I went through because this was an evolving realization over many years that before I got to the point to realize we could rigorously pack circles to find the arrangement. Even when I was very young, I'd fold origami designs of other people, and I'd fold them and then quite often just pull them apart to sort of see how they went together. And I noticed that whenever you had a leg, you could recognize the folds that went into that leg. They had a very distinctive fan-like radial pattern. And it always did seem to take up a roughly circular region of paper. And so I did get the sense, even very early on, that when I wanted to design something, I needed to make sure that there was enough paper for a flap of the right length. That if I tried to fold something, and I wanted to make the flap longer, it somehow needed to take up more paper. And so early on, I discovered that I could I could in my designs ensure that I had enough paper just by making little boundaries, drawing a boundary that sort of marked out how much paper I thought the flat would need. And so that was a rough, crude idea that over the years I realized if I used precise circles, that always gave me exactly enough paper. And so it wasn't a single aha moment, but a series of realizations that let me kind of refine these vague notions into more formally mathematical terms. And I should point out that people continue to refine these notions so that nowadays, in fact, we don't so much use circles, or circles are not the final stage, but people are now packing circles and polygons in ways that give crease patterns that are, for example, easier to fold or easier to design. So they continue to refine these packing ideas and to use them. Now, to answer your second question, which is, as you said, the pots don't look like flaps. And we use very different math to design things like the pots. It still shares ideas with the circle packing in that we figure out what paper is needed for the exterior shape that we're after, something like the pots, and then we have to figure out how do we add folds in between the surface shapes to collapse the paper down. I'm going to jump through my slides to a picture in the Mathematica notebook that I think might help illustrate this. So here in the Mathematica package, you can see creases, and there's a cross section. There's three stacked images. The left one is the cross section. The middle one is the crease pattern. And in that middle shape, some of those regions of paper end up being the outside of the pot. And that's kind of the shape you're after. And some of those regions end up being those flanges that you see sticking off the pots. And in effect, those flanges are kind of leftover paper. They're not really important to getting the shape of the pot. So what we do for this design, this type of design, is figure out what paper goes into the part that we need, and that's the sides of the pot. And then how do we add folds to the rest of it to bring that excess, to get that excess paper out of the way, and in this case that excess paper forms into flanges. So it ends up being different mathematics, but the core mathematical idea is the same. It's a division of the paper into regions that you need to get the shape that you're after, and how do you cleanly deal with all the extra paper that you don't need. Now, I see Carol's just asked a question. Can I talk a little bit about Mathematica packages? And I should mention, Mathematica is a computer program. It's published by Wolfram Software, and it's a very general purpose, kind of a general purpose programming language, but it's really a general purpose toolkit for doing any sort of mathematical manipulation. I love it for origami, and you'll find people using it for things anywhere from stock prediction to statistics to geometry, algebra, number theory, graph theory. Just about any mathematical field can be addressed within Mathematica. I like it for origami because it's very easy and powerful to set up not just mathematical analysis, and it can do algebra, it can do number theory, but also to set up the visualizations like I did in this slide. I think the entire package, which is really a computer program that creates the display of the cross-section with human manipulatable points. You can click on points and move them around. It computes the cross-section. It computes a 3D rendering of the folded form. And it's a total of about 50 lines of code to do the whole thing. So it's really powerful. And Wolfram has educational versions of their software so that it is accessible and can be used to create things even for folks in, I'd say, even in high school level. People could create Mathematica structures and packages and renderings and the like. I see a question from Betty. So she asks, I hear you presented to kids in New York City, and how do kids relate to the math and origami? And one of the things I love about the mathematics of origami is that there's math at all levels. So there's high school geometry, there's even elementary school geometry, and there's an educator in Israel named Miri Golan who has an entire math education program called Origametria that is focused at the elementary school level. Elementary school kids can learn things about simple geometry, triangles, shapes, and you can do it with a very tactile, hands-on way. People can physically manipulate the abstract concepts that they're talking about. They don't have to rely on, on just pictures in a book. Miri's name is Miri, M-I-R-I, Golan, G-O-L-A-N, and she was a speaker at the keynote speaker at one of the origami science conventions that I talked about. So there's math at all levels there's origami math at all levels of education. So we can find math that's appropriate to elementary. You can find math appropriate to high school, to gifted high school, and yet there is also origami math that is at the cutting edge of mathematics research. So we have undergrads and even graduate level research going on investigating more sophisticated aspects of origami math.
Do you see the question from Sue Childs, Robert?
Yep, I see Sue's question. She says, we've just gotten Mathematica at school, at secondary school in the UK, and exploring ways to use it with the students. Would origami be a good starting point? And what age students can access it? And I don't. That's kind of a different question from. I mean, that's a much broader question, I'd say. How to bring Mathematica to secondary school students. Origami could be the right way, but I'd say you should cast your net more broadly, because there's a lot more beyond origami, I mean vastly more beyond origami, that can be done with Mathematica and with students. So I'd say yes, that is one way to get them introduced. I've got some demonstration projects. There's a link that's been posted on the chat window. But there are many, many more Mathematica demonstrations that don't have anything to do with origami, but that would probably be exciting to secondary school students. Like many computer tools, there's sort of two levels of using it. You can just treat these demonstration projects as black boxes to demonstrate various mathematical concepts, or you can introduce kids to a way of programming and thinking about mathematical issues by getting them involved in actually writing Mathematica code. You start out by having them solve simple problems and write codes to do very simple things, and then they can build up their knowledge and capabilities from there.
I just added a comment, Robert. I think you're right that it's certainly broader in terms of Mathematica, or we often use Maple in our courses, but we do send students to Wolfram Alpha because that's kind of a nice way to introduce people to mathematical ideas just by searching for things. but I don't think Wolfram Alpha does anything with origami, does it?
So I see a question from Carol, who asks, what other areas of math and art interest you? And I have a pretty broad interest in math, albeit at a shallow level. I say I'm broad, but I'm not very deep. One of the things that got me excited about math in high school was number theory, and so I did a little study in high school. I attended a summer number theory kind of camp at the University of Chicago, and I still kind of keep my ears open whenever there's something that goes by that is not something that goes by, but that is still at a low enough level that I can understand. But the fun thing is, since all math is related, you can find ways of bringing. You can find ways where unrelated mathematical fields pop up in surprising ways. So an origami problem that turned out that people pursue is the problem of origami constructions. How do you fold a given dimension or a given length or a given angle pretty precisely in a very small number of folds? And it turns out efficient solutions to that come from number theory types of operations like continued fractions and Chinese remainder theorem and all that sort of thing. So, so even math that's unrelated to origami may very well come back and be linked to origami. Now, to answer your other question, what other areas of art? I'm interested in art of all types, particularly sculptural arts, 3D art, and I've taken some of my origami and translated it into other media, creating bronze and metal sculptures of origami objects. I'd say most of my art interest is concentrated in the sculptural area. Now I see Carol asks, what other materials interest you aside from the metals? Well, I do like metals. I like them because of their rigidity and sturdiness, and it's a way of realizing origami that people can handle. But it's certainly not restricted to metal. And I'm going to be doing some investigations, I'm starting to explore creating other sculptural forms in materials like fiberglass and polymers that allow us to get to larger size and skirt some of the problems that you run into with the mass of metal objects. For folding, a lot of technological applications of folding want to use a material that's other than paper. So we'll use polymers, mylar, Kapton, acetate, or even folding very thin wood or other felted materials, felted barks and the like. So in terms of actual folding, just about anything, if it takes a fold, I'm interested in exploring, trying to create origami-like structures from it.
Marge has shared a resource in Wolfram Alpha, but that does talk a little bit about origami. Robert, do you know any other connections with Wolfram Alpha and origami?
I haven't explored Wolfram Alpha all that much. When I've tried to use it, it usually doesn't answer the questions that I asked it, so I haven't spent much time on it. I saw a question go by. I think Veronica asked if I played with 3D printing, and the answer is yes, and I'm going to show you an example of, this is a 3D printed collection of cranes. So So in this case, 4 cranes head to tail, and I've done a few 3D printed sculptures based on touching cranes. This one's 5-fold, and that's tremendously fun. I could easily spend a lot more time exploring that.
Thanks for showing those. Did you have any other origami in your office that you can put up to the screen?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I'll show, in this case, this is one of my most recent designs. It's one that's going into a book. It's a yellow jacket. So we've got, I'm not sure how well that's going to show, but you can kind of see his different parts. And I'm going to go grab one more piece. This is a new design that's based on the pod idea. It's kind of inspired by onion domes, and it's inspired also by a design by Janine Mosley that she calls a bud. Her bud is square. This has hexagonal symmetry, and sort of what I like, and one of the things I was after in it was to get it to completely close up on the bottom, and it holds together on its own. These curved shapes have a lot of tension in them, but you can, getting something that to lock together so that it holds under its own, it resists its tensile forces is a little bit of a challenge. So that's why I did that for this shape. And I see a question from Gary. What kind of paper do you use, since tearing can be a problem with complex shapes? And there's 2 aspects to that. One is the paper, and I use a lot of different papers depending on the subject. Some subjects you want thick paper. That purple onion dome I just showed you is folded from Canson watercolor paper. The yellow jacket's folded from a very thin paper made by a studio in Massachusetts called the Origami Studio. And the artist, Michael LaFosse, who's a great origami artist, specializes in paper for origami. But part of the challenge is also knowing how to manipulate the paper to minimize unnecessary stresses. So watercolor paper, it's good paper, but it does tear. So when we fold something, one of the challenges is manipulating the paper in such a way that you don't allow stresses to concentrate at a place where the paper might rip. So there's also some skill that goes into that. See a question from Marge. It asks, do you have any resources or websites for the medical scientific applications? And I do have resources. The best resources are the 3 proceedings books for the 3 conferences that have, there have actually been 5 conferences, but only the last 3 have proceedings books. So the books are called Origami 3, Origami 4, and Origami 5. And you can find them on Amazon or on my website. There's prominent links to buy them. To places that sell them. I don't sell them myself. And that's really the best place to find resources on the medical and scientific applications.
And do you see Veronica's question? It's above Marge's about, she's interested in how you got involved in using origami in industry.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. How I got that sort of fell into it. In that one of that I was approached. In the case of the Livermore telescope, I had written up a paper for a computer science journal about this circle packing algorithm. And so that got my name into the literature databases. So when the Livermore guys were looking for someone to assist with, to help them come up with a folding pattern, they did a literature search. And they found my paper, and that's what got me involved in them. And then since then, I think it's more been the case that people hear about my work, or they do some Google, and that leads them to my website. But generally, they approach me for and say, I've got a folding problem, and it seems like maybe origami might have a solution. And every once in a while, it does.
Well, we're right at the end of our time of getting close. I'm going to end the recording now, but we have a few more minutes to ask some questions, but I'll end the recording.